However, this, of course, as we know, is not the ultimate fate of humanity through our own choice. God created us free. He gave us freedom to choose because He wanted a love relationship with us. And love cannot be forced. Love is always a choice. If it is forced, it is not love. Sometimes people say, why did God let us do that? It's because of His great love and respect for us. And He wanted us to be able to choose freely to have a love relationship with Him. So in Genesis chapter 3, we find the story of how things went wrong. The basic gist of the story hinges on God's command not to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Man had everything he needed, and yet there was only one thing that God asked him not to do. And this is the one thing that the tempter, who is presented as a serpent, but actually belongs to the world of spiritual beings and not the material creation. The spiritual creation occurred before material creation, and the angels were given also a trial, a thing that they were not supposed to choose. And even though their intellects were greater than ours at the time, and they understood fully the consequences of their choice, some of them did choose their own will over God's will. This tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, as John Paul II puts it, signifies the insurmountable limit for man and for any creature. The important thing is, we are creatures, not the Creator. There is only one Creator, and there is a limit beyond which we cannot go. We cannot be God. And this is what the serpent promised to Eve, that if you eat, the reason that God does not want you to eat is that you will become just like Him. Well, that's impossible. But for whatever reason, she succumbed to this tempter because the tree looked good and all that. And not only did she eat of it, but she gave some to her husband to eat. And their eyes were opened, and they realized what they had done and what the consequences of that would be. The reason we talk about this way here back at the beginning is because if we don't talk about sin and the truth about sin, we cannot talk about the redemption that Jesus Christ brought to us, because we wouldn't understand why is it that we needed to be saved. What does salvation mean? Once again from John Paul II, which these last two slides are from one of his talks, original sin caused a fundamental change in mankind, because no creature can be like God. When mankind yielded to this temptation, a personal sin was created. Personal sin is a choice that an individual person makes to put his or her own will above the will of God. The very first sin that occurred in humanity, called original sin, or the first sin, changed human nature. It introduced into human nature something that wasn't there before, the state of original sin. As created, human nature contained no sin. It was a good state. It was a state in full communion with God. But because man chose against God's will, from that time on, there was a fallen state. Mankind existed in a state where there was sin, where there was evil in the world. Interesting to consider, this sin of man was the reflection and the consequence of a sin that had already occurred in the world of invisible beings. And by yielding to this temptation, man actually became the slave and accomplice of the rebellious spirits. By yielding to the temptation of the serpent, mankind became, in a sense, a colleague of the devil, and the devil acquired and assumed a certain power over mankind. From that time on, it became easier for him to tempt us to go against the will of God, which, once he himself had fallen, it became his complete goal in his life to bring other creatures down to his own level. Here we have an interesting observation, that once Adam and Eve had eaten of the fruit, of course they hid themselves from God because they were ashamed, because they understood what they did and already sort of repented of it, because God asked, when God asked what happened, the man said, well, I was naked, so we hid ourselves. And God said, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I had forbidden you to eat? And the man replied, the woman whom you put here with me, she gave me fruit from the tree, so I ate it. Same thing with the woman. The woman, God asked the woman, what is this that you have done? And the woman answered, the snake tricked me, so I ate it. One of the big things to notice in this little segment of Genesis is that neither one of them, when God asked them, what have you done? Neither one of them said, I did it and I'm sorry. Neither one of them took responsibility for their actions. The man blamed the woman, and in a sense he almost blamed God. You gave me this woman, and she gave me the fruit, and therefore I ate it. So it wasn't my fault. It was your fault for making the woman. It was her fault for giving me the fruit. He takes no responsibility for choosing to eat it. And the same thing with the woman. She doesn't say, oh gosh, I realize I shouldn't have done it. I'll never do it again. I'm sorry. No, the snake tricked me, so I ate it. First recorded history of someone saying, the devil made me do it, comes out of Genesis, right here. So what is the impact of original sin? Well, first of all, the personal sin of Adam and Eve. Each of them did commit personal sin. They each chose for themselves to do something that they knew they weren't supposed to do. They chose to follow their own will rather than God's will. They chose to trust the word of a creature rather than the word of the Creator. The interesting thing about it is what they grasped at, what they took, they would have received. God intended from the beginning to give us everything, to give us the knowledge, to give us an eternal relationship in happiness with Him. But we needed to show that we could wait and receive it, not to grasp at it. They grasped. So this grasping, rather than being open to receiving from God, is an important characteristic of sin, of all sin. Things look good to us temporarily. They look good to us in the moment, but many times it's not the right time for that particular good to be yours. If you open yourself to God, if you give everything over to Him, you will ultimately receive everything. The consequence for Adam and Eve was they lost the grace of their original holiness. They became subject to death, and sin became universally present in the world. Because humans chose to sin, sin became present in the world. And after that time, every person born into the world was born into a fallen world, was born into a world in which human nature had chosen against God, was born into a wounded and weakened, but not totally corrupt and irretrievable human nature. This is what Christ, who is often called the new Adam, this is that from which He came to redeem us. This is why we needed to be redeemed, because on our own we could not make up for the sin, our sin, against the infinite goodness of God. One of the effects of original sin, and in a sense of all sin, is what we call the fourfold alienation. When the human person chooses to sin, he alienates himself from God, obviously, because he has chosen to disobey God, from himself. When you have sinned, when a person has sinned, you feel disjointed within yourself. You feel this discomfort. You yourself feel incomplete and unsettled. The human person who has sinned is alienated from others, other persons, because if you are not whole within yourself, then how can you relate in a complete and open and trusting way to others? If you know even within yourself that you can sin and cannot totally be trusted, how can you believe that any other person could be totally trusted? Or how can you interact with another person in a good and open and loving way? Completely. A human who has sinned also has become alienated from the natural world, is not simply and completely and integrated into the world, but has become alienated. The world becomes at many times a hostile place for the human person, something that only with effort can we achieve a working relationship with the natural world. We broke our covenant with God. God never broke the covenant. It was humans who broke the covenant. Another consequence of original sin is what is called concupiscence. And this is something that remains even after baptism. It is a disordering of human appetites and desires. We have less control than we were meant to have over our natural desires. And this is what's called one of the temporal consequences of original sin. This was introduced into time. We are in a temporal existence now, not an eternal existence. It's an inclination to sin. It's even after we are baptized, we still have that inclination to follow our own cravings, our own will. Yes, the grace of baptism and the grace also of the sacrament of reconciliation helps us to resist this temptation. But because there is sin in human nature, we still retain this tendency to want our own will versus God's will, to not want anybody else to tell us what to do. And also, human nature has become subject to ignorance, suffering, and death.